Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. As we fast approach the French presidential and legislative elections set for April, the bookies have their pens to paper, eagerly watching how the opinions of the French electorate are swinging. As the contenders for the Élysée Palace have thrown their hat into the ring, even though President Emmanuel Macron is biding his time before officially declaring that he will stand for a second 5-year mandate. Now, to gaze into the political crystal ball, I'm joined today by Bruno Jeanbart, who is Vice President of Opinion Way, one of France's most highly regarded research and polling agencies, for an assessment of how the French are feeling in the run-up to the vote. Bruno, you're very welcome to Paris Perspective today.
Hello, thank you.
Now, no matter what the realities are, political spin doctors will always claim that polls, wherever they come from, are wrong when the tide appears to be going against their chosen candidate, the people that they work for. How should people digest opinion polls when they see them in the press these days? Statistics can, at the end of the day, be manipulated.
Well, I would say that we have to be careful about the data for the moment because we are still far away from the election. And we know that the closest we are to the election, the best the polls are comparing to the final result. We know that before 50 days before the election, it's still very far away to be sure that what is shown by the data is going to be what will occur in the polling station. So let's be cautious about that. I don't think it's possible to be manipulated. The polls can be wrong. It happens not so often, and especially in the French presidential election, which is traditionally quite well predicted by the polls, but it can happen. So we still have to wait and to be a bit closer to the election.
Indeed, that does bring me back 5 years to 2017, where when we look back then, Emmanuel Macron was essentially unheard of outside of France, and even within François Hollande's administration, he didn't appear too often in the media. We all know that he's quite media reticent, media shy himself. In March of 2017, how was Macron polling back then?
Well, in March, he was already ahead in the polls and leading the race, but very close with Le Pen, and at the end he was first before Le Pen. But in January, if we took this example of 2017, he was not the favorite, and we were still expecting at the same period 5 years ago that the second run and the runoff will be Le Pen against Fillon, the conservative candidate. So it shows that January is still early in the French presidential race.
Sure thing. Now, indeed, looking back to the hot candidate back then, that was indeed François Fillon, who was the chosen representative of the traditional centre-right Les Républicains party. Now, looking back then, one could say that François Hollande, the socialist president, essentially imploded the traditional centre-left by not standing for a second term because he polled so poorly. But could anyone have predicted back then the collapse of the centre-right, Les Républicains, in the wake of François Fillon and the scandal that brought him down, which then led to the meteoric rise of Emmanuel Macron?
No, it was difficult to expect. And of course, everybody was very surprised about the affair itself and the impact of the affair. But what was already predictable at that time was that there was a new candidate, which was Emmanuel Macron, and this candidate was able to be a surprise and maybe to be the new candidate that would lead the left parties in the race, because at that period the socialist primary to choose a candidate replacing François Hollande was already in huge difficulties.
And just a little aside here, Emmanuel Macron tried to make a great entrance onto the world stage by arriving in a speedboat up the Seine to declare his candidacy. You being in the research and the polling kind of industry, how did the French electorate react to that little stunt that he pulled back then?
I think when he resigned from the as a minister in August 2016 and he declared his candidacy, I think nobody was really predicting that he would become the next president of France. He had nothing to be the next president. He was too young compared to the last presidential election. He was without any political party, any traditional support. So it was really a great surprise, which had a lot of reasons. You talk about the renouncement of François Hollande to be again a candidate. You talk about the scandal about François Fillon. All this obviously really changed the course and the way the presidential race occurred 5 years ago.
And now, recently in a book that you have written, you described Emmanuel Macron in the title of the book as the président anormal, or the abnormal president. I think that would be better maybe translated as the accidental president. Why do you call him this? Why did you choose that title?
Because, as I said, he really broke all the rules, which was driving the presidential elections in France before that. I mean, normally you needed to have a long political career to have been elected before as a mayor or as an MP. You needed to be supported by a political party, and everything was not the case for Emmanuel Macron. And so it seemed that what happened was the consequences of the rejection by the population and the voters of the traditional left and right. But it was also a small amount of small cases that occurred. I mean, it could have been very different if François Hollande would have been again candidate at the presidential election if there was not a scandal about François Fillon, the conservative candidate, and even if François Bayrou, the traditional centrist candidate, decided to run again, as he did in 2002, 7, and 12.
Now, recently, your agency, Opinion Way, has put Macron in the lead of, well, the list of potential candidates or people who have already declared their candidacy. You've put Macron at 24%, followed closely behind by the National Rally stalwart, that is, of course, Marine Le Pen, who's at 17%, who is herself neck and neck as things stand now with the traditional Les Républicains right-wing candidate Valérie Pécresse. Now, here in January, you have mentioned that it is too early to really call it, but is that margin of between 24% and 17% enough to secure or to guarantee Macron will still be able to maintain that lead in the run-up to the primaries to secure a second round in the presidentials in April?
Of course, as 2017 showed us, we should never say never in the presidential campaigns. But it seems that his position is quite strong enough to be one of the two candidates of the second round. Why? Because when you look at what is going on with Macron, he's very stable for months. Instead of the pandemic crisis, instead of many things, which shows that he still has a strong base support from his voters of 2017. So I would say that he should be able to reach the second round, but we have to wait a bit because there's always one issue for the incumbent in France, is when he becomes candidate and no more president. Yeah. And it's not already the case with Macron, who hasn't declared a new candidacy for the moment. So I would say that after 1 or 2 weeks, when he will be declared as candidate, we will have the a certainty about that for the second round.
And indeed, he'll have to follow all the rules as the other candidates with media representation that he can enjoy as president to take up as much time as he wants if he wishes to go on national television. But looking at the actual issues that are on the table or are purportedly on the table that are really getting the media going, the right wing, be it the traditional centre-right or the extreme right, there is a hard right-wing ball being played with immigration and security being the key words on the hustings. Le Pen and Pécresse themselves are battling to try and win the hearts of both the moderate and the extreme elements of the right wing. But when questioned in polling surveys, what appears to distinguish those two candidates when they're trying to woo their base electorate?
I would say that for the moment, the most difference between Le Pen and Pécresse is the base that they have as voters. I mean, Le Pen is very strong with blue-collar workers. She's very strong also with people with low income, low level of education, which is not the case of Pécresse, which is much more traditionally as a conservative candidate, strong with white-collar workers, people with high level of education, with old voters, which is not the case for Le Pen, which is much more stronger with young voters. So it's a sociological cleavage, I would say, between them. But both, they are trying to gather the voters from the rural areas, which is the very important part of the voters, 25% of the voters, and where Emmanuel Macron is weaker.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting there. The white versus blue-collar voters that need to be wooed there on the right wing. However, one thing that is undeniable in the run-up to the elections and to the whole campaigns that are getting going is souverainisme, or French nationalism, that is playing a key role in this election. There are lots of allusions to General de Gaulle, a bit of nostalgia thrown in there from all sides of the political spectrum, especially with right-wing candidates, coming down hard on migrants, cleaning up ghettoized non-France neighbourhoods, and then, of course, this rhetoric of reconquering no-go zones. Is that really what's highest on the agenda for the average French voter?
Well, yeah, it's a very, very important issue. I mean, when we look at the data that we have, the most important issue for the moment is purchasing power. People, and because of the increasing prices, it's very strong in the French population. But the second one is crime, and immigration is the fourth one. So it shows that really this traditional right-wing issues are very, very important in the French population at the moment, and it explains why we have this high level of vote for in the voting intentions for the I would say the large far right, both Le Pen and Zemmour, and which are gathering about 30% of the voters, which is incredibly high when we look at the record of the presidential election, when the highest was for Le Pen in 2017 with 21%. So they are very, very strong issues, and they are also increased by the fact that most of the candidates think that it's one of the weaknesses of Emmanuel Macron, and it's more difficult to attack him on the pandemic crisis or on the economy than on this kind of issue.
And indeed, you mentioned the Z word there. That is, of course, Eric Zemmour, who is the more extreme of the far right, the candidate, the polemicist, the essayist and former journalist, who is really Marine Le Pen's bête noire on the political scene. He arrived like a bombshell, and he put out a wonderful launch campaign that was very reminiscent of President General de Gaulle, and very, very much looking back at a pastiche of things in the past, but also with very, very hard images of riots, of flames, and it was something that reminded me almost of a zombie movie. He came in like a bombshell, but will his thunder last? Will he really shake the foundations of the far right here in France?
I think we're in between. I mean, what he missed is the fact that he has this strong dynamics in September, October. But he missed to kill definitely Marine Le Pen by being ahead of her in the voting intentions. And now she's leading Zemmour by 3 to 5 points, depending on the day and on the polls, which is a problem for him because now, as you said, there is this neck-to-neck race between Le Pen and Pécresse. And so some voters of Zemmour may think that it's not any more useful to vote for him, and they should much more choose between Pécresse and Le Pen to define who's going to be the opponent of Macron on the second round. The second problem that he has, I think, is that he could have been the French populist like Trump in the US, but he doesn't really want to play all the rules of the populist. I mean, it has a much more complex thought than the populists traditionally have, and it's, I think, a problem. Is in between here also, between a very traditional populist movement, as we see in many countries, and a much more intellectual way of thinking. And what we see in the poll is that he's not able for the moment to catch the blue-collar workers to Marine Le Pen, which is very, very important in this race.
Indeed. Now, you did touch upon there now, since we've been discussing that, Macron is facing difficult areas to really try and gain a foothold from both the left and the right to, really give an identity to the La République En Marche party for a second mandate. But we haven't mentioned the COVID pandemic. I mean, do people who have been polled so far, do they feel that the present government has dealt with the COVID pandemic correctly? And indeed, you're talking about populism there. What about Macron's recent comments about he's going to piss off the unvaccinated? Has that helped or hindered his popularity?
I think when you look at, we have measured every week since now 2 years the way that people think the government is dealing with the pandemic crisis. And what we have seen is that during most of the time, people were dissatisfied with the way the pandemic was ruled by the government, except during this autumn. From September to December, there was a quite strong majority saying and supporting the way the government was acting against the pandemic. It has changed really since the Christmas period and especially in January. And now we are again 55% of the people who say they are not dealing well with the pandemic. It's a problem with Macron because it means that, of course, it's weakening him. And when you talk about the fact that he said he wants to piss off the unvaccinated, I think it was a mistake because you have to know that in France, many people got the vaccine because they were obliged to. I mean, because of the decision of the government to say that if you are not vaccinated or if you don't have a negative test, you can't go to the restaurant, you can't go to the cinema, you can't go to the theater. So, I mean, it's not only about the 10% who are still not vaccinated, this issue. It's also about all these people who are not in favor of the vaccine, but they accepted to do it because they were obliged to, and they can be quite upset by the sentence of the president, especially in a period where everybody sees with his relatives or friends that now people get the virus even if they are vaccinated, because It seems like Omicron, you don't have a strong illness when you're vaccinated with Omicron, but you can get the vaccine and be positive at the virus.
Indeed, it is cutting through the populations here in Europe. Now, we haven't mentioned France's left wing. What we saw back in 2017, we have mentioned the collapse of the left wing following François Hollande's reticence to put himself up for a second mandate because he was polling so poorly. But what are the great hopes for the traditional left here? There have been movements from the left, the big hitters such as Taubira, Hidalgo, and from the Greens, Jadot, of coming together in a grand coalition. Do you feel that will strike a chord with traditional left-wing voters? And where would La France Insoumise, the kind of the firebrand far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, fit within this coalition? Do you feel that it's likely, and will it gather any traction in the coming months?
I think it's a strong mess for the left now in the presidential election. When you look at all the candidates, there are still 7 or 8 now. One of them withdrew yesterday, but there are still a lot. They are all polling at 25-26% only, which is very low. And as there are many, the first one is Mélenchon with 9 or 10. Only. So it's very, very, very weak. One of the problems and one of the things that the left doesn't want to accept is that why are they so low? It's because a strong part of their voters are voting for Emmanuel Macron still. They were the voters who made the election of Macron in 2017, and they are still supporting him now. They come from the left, and they are still with Macron. So that's a very strong issue. They were able to recover and to catch again these voters who went to Macron. For Mélenchon, I think it's probably going to be an election, the last election for him, and maybe a difficult election compared to 2017. He reached nearly 20%. Mm-hmm. I think if he's able to do at the end 10, 12, it's going to be very high for him, because there was a lot of disappointment about Mélenchon during the last 5 years, about the fact that he didn't try to gather all the left with him and to rebuild something. And the second point was about his personal image. There was some scandal or some behavior that he had during the period, which was really decrease the way he was seen by the French.
Okay, and now finally, Bruno, looking back at the first mandate of President Macron, if one can say, the most explosive thing that happened during his presidency, apart from the COVID pandemic, was the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement that shook the country to its foundations, with protest after protest getting more and more violent here in France. And that was, of course, over fuel hikes. And it really underlined the urban-rural divide here in France. Let's just see now, when he will throw his name in the hat, or sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors, when he throws his hat in the ring in the coming weeks, what is the best case scenario for Emmanuel Macron to regain the confidence of the electorate? And indeed, what is the worst case scenario for Macron heading into these elections in April?
I would say the best scenario would be that he's able to keep the situation that he made with his election, which is he's gathering all the I would say the traditional parties, the centrist party, center-left and center-right together. And he has these voters who are pro-European, pro-business with him, and against the populist movement, which is clearly now in the end of Marine Le Pen. And so he's going to have a second round against Marine Le Pen. If he's able to do that and to really keep this picture of the French political system with him as the reasonable candidate against the populist, it's the best scenario. The worst would be that the conservative candidate, Valérie Pécresse, is able to win her fight against Le Pen and is able to qualify for the second round. Yeah. I think if Pécresse is going on the second round, she has a pretty good chance to beat Macron. Why? Because Macron has this strange situation, probably as an incumbent, very strong support of a small base, 25-30% of the population, but also a lot of people who hate him. And I think that if he's not against Le Pen on the second round, it's probably what will happen is that a lot of people will vote to change Macron and to beat Macron. And for example, traditional far-right voters are not in favor of Pécresse, are not convinced by Pécresse. They think she's too moderate, she's too centrist. Mm-hmm. But I think they would prefer to beat Macron and have Pécresse elected than to let Macron be re-elected for a second term.
So Pécresse is the one to watch in the coming weeks, it would appear. Bruno Jeanbart, Vice President of Opinion Way, thank you very much for being on the programme today.
Thank you.
And thank you for logging on to Paris Perspective. You can access all our episodes on RFI English /podcast, and indeed wherever you get your podcasts. I'm David Coffey, and I'll be back in 2 weeks' time with the next edition of Paris Perspective.